We begin today's show in Yemen, where political turmoil is pushing the country to the brink of a humanitarian crisis. The United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, says more than half of Yemen's 12 million children are chronically malnourished. Unemployment in the country has reached 35%.
Well, a new cover story in The Nation magazine says U.S. counterterrorism operations have ignited an Islamist uprising. The article by Jeremy Scahill, called Washington's War in Yemen Backfires, says U.S. missile strikes, civilian drone casualties, and deepening poverty in Yemen have all contributed to the rise of groups such as Ansar al-Sharia and al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. These groups have gained popularity partly by filling a void left by the central government in Yemen. They repair roads, restore electricity, distribute food, and run security patrols. The article goes on to say U.S. counterterrorism policy may have strengthened the very threat it sought to eliminate by linking military aid to counterterrorism efforts and inciting anger through drone warfare. Jeremy Scahill joins us now to discuss his latest piece. He's the national security correspondent for The Nation magazine, author of the best-selling book Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army, and a Democracy Now! Correspondent. Jeremy, welcome to Democracy Now! Welcome back, of course. Talk about this trip that you just recently returned from in Yemen.
Well, you know, Yemen is in a situation right now where the only ruler that a unified Yemen has really known, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who governed the country for 33 years, is going to be officially leaving power. And there's going to be an election next week where there's only one candidate, the vice president of the country. And while this election is playing out in front of the eyes of the world, many Yemenis say they're going to boycott it, that they don't feel that it's democratic, that an election does not mean you have one person that you either vote yes or no for. And so you have protests that are sort of taking place around the capital of Sana'a. But the rest of Yemen, and even in the capital Sana'a, is concerned more with local issues of security and stability, than they are with participating in an election that they consider to be a sort of farce. The only U.S. priority in Yemen, as has been articulated through U.S. funding, is the issue of counterterrorism. The United States is absolutely obsessed with 300 to 700 people that are members of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. James Clapper, the director of national intelligence, has identified it as the single greatest terrorist threat to the U.S. homeland. And you know, U.S. officials talk about AQAP, this group, in a way that I think gives it a lot more power than it's capable of. Yes, the underwear bomber, the alleged underwear bomber, Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib, went to Yemen and then left Yemen and tried to bring down the airliner over Detroit. The parcel bomb plot, where there were these printer cartridges put on planes and they attempted to ship them as explosives to Jewish community centers in the United States, originated in Yemen. And of course, you had Anwar al-Awlaki, who was a U.S.-born cleric who basically his entire power in the world was due to YouTube, where he would go on YouTube and you know, make proclamations. And you saw him sort of get radicalized as the U.S. intensified attacks against Yemen. That's about it. That's what you have in Yemen. And yet it is the source of a great deal of funding on the counterterrorism level and really obsessive compulsive behavior on the part of U.S. intelligence officials. Having said that, there is a real group in Yemen called al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and they do, in fact, want to attack the United States. What's happened, though, is that the Obama administration picked up from where the Bush administration left off. The Bush administration, beginning in the mid-2000s, started to build up Yemeni counterterrorism forces that were entirely controlled by Ali Abdullah Saleh's family. His nephew Yahya ran the counterterrorism unit. His son Ahmed Ali ran the Republican Guards. They got all of this funding from the U.S. They built up those forces. Those forces have almost never been used to actually battle anyone determined to be terrorists. They've existed primarily for the defense of the Saleh regime. And all this U.S. money, way disproportionate to the amount of money the U.S. has spent on humanitarian aid, has gone basically to the Saleh family military units. Obama, though, did something that President Bush had only done once, to my knowledge, and that is to start bombing Yemen. On December 17, 2009, President Obama authorized cruise missile strikes against Yemen, and they smashed into a remote village in Abyan province called Al-Majla and killed more than 40 Bedouins. And when that incident happened on December 17, 2009, the Yemeni government took responsibility for those bombings and said that it was a counterterrorism operation, that it had succeeded, that a number of al-Qaeda people were killed. There were even reports that al-Awlaki himself was killed. Well, it turns out that, in fact, it was a U.S. missile strike, that it was Tomahawk cruise missiles. In fact, we were able to interview people from that village. One woman who lost 7 members of her family, another man 17 members of his family. It was a dirt-poor Bedouin village that was hit. There was only one man that anyone in the area could identify as having any connection to al-Qaeda, and he was a mujahideen during the war in Afghanistan, which, of course, the United States was supporting the mujahideen during the mujahideen war in the 1980s. That then kicked off a series of airstrikes. The Obama administration began an air war in Yemen. Sometimes the strikes hit the people that were the intended targets, but oftentimes civilians were killed. And so what happened is that the prophecy envisioned by the leaders of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and envisioned by Anwar al-Awlaki came true. And that was that the United States intended to turn Yemen into its next Afghanistan, its next Iraq, its next Pakistan. So you had the 1-2 punch, or actually there were 3 punches. The first one is the airstrikes. The second one is supporting Saleh family military units. And then the third is not funding any humanitarian programs and allowing the vast majority of the U.S. money to go toward units which were then used as agents of domestic repression.
But, Jeremy, let me ask you, because Saleh's argument always was for clinging to power, that he was the force of stability that would prevent al-Qaeda from growing in Yemen. To what degree is there domestic resistance that's separate and apart from al-Qaeda in Yemen, armed resistance, and to what degree is it largely al-Qaeda?
Well, I mean, look, the arrogance of the U.S. was always thinking that that whatever U.S. official was sent to Yemen was smarter than Ali Abdullah Saleh. He was a master chess player, and he milked counterterrorism as his cash cow, and he did it beginning in November of 2001 when he came to Washington and pitched President Bush on the idea that I'm going to be your ally in the war on terror. I mean, Ali Abdullah Saleh has sent jihadists to Afghanistan. I remember when I was in Baghdad in 2002, all of these Yemeni Baathists showed up in Baghdad to fight. There's no way they would have gone there without the consent of the Saleh government. And so, Juan, to answer your question, the Saleh regime was very clever, and it used the U.S. paranoia about Islamic terrorism to get hundreds of millions of dollars in funding from the U.S. When in reality, the strongest forces in Yemen opposing his government had almost nothing to do with al-Qaeda whatsoever. In fact, you could argue that Ali Abdullah Saleh had a closer relationship to these Islamist militants than his domestic opponents. You have a southern secessionist movement. Yemen used to be 2 countries, remember. There was the socialist south, and then which had all of the natural resources, and then there was the north. And Ali Abdullah Saleh was able to consolidate his grip on power when he unified the countries by bringing in all of these tribes that had been expelled by the socialists and saying, hey, I'm going to give you your power back. So he had this patronage network that he set up of the tribes. But there is a very, very strong secessionist movement in the south. In fact, when we were in Aden, which is the port city in the south where the USS Cole was bombed in 2000, October of 2000, the southern flag was flying. There was graffiti on the walls, North, get out of the south. And I spoke with several powerful tribal sheikhs that said, now that Ali Abdullah Saleh is gone, we want southern Yemen to take over the south again. In the north, you have a rebellion of a minority of Shiite Muslims. They're called the Houthis. In fact, Ali Abdullah Saleh is not a Sunni. He's a Zaydi Shiite from North Yemen, but he sided with all of these Sunni forces inside of Yemen. And the Houthis have been engaged in a rebellion against Saleh's government for years, and the Saleh government has mercilessly pummeled the Houthis. And it's drawn in a proxy war involving the Saudis attacking on the one hand, and then you have the Houthis seeking out support, from other Shiite allies in the region. So Saleh has manipulated masterfully the threat of al-Qaeda to get weapons and to build up his forces that could be used then only for the defense of the regime, only to take out his political opponents. When Ali Abdullah Saleh felt that the U.S. was ignoring him, all of a sudden 20 al-Qaeda suspects would escape from a prison. And so we went to this city, Zinjibar, which is in Abyan province in the south of Yemen. Almost no journalists have ever made it into that city. We went to the front lines and to investigate because a group calling itself Ansar al-Sharia had taken over a number of towns, including Zinjibar. And when I started interviewing people who were very well connected to the security apparatus in Yemen, they said Ali Abdullah Saleh let them take it over as a sort of last message to the United States, that if you let me go, I'm going to show you what will happen. And what will happen is that al-Qaeda is going to take over. And so all of a sudden you see Ansar al-Sharia, the supporters or partisans of Sharia law, taking over these cities and creating their own Sharia councils, doing very brutal acts against suspected criminals, chopping off limbs. Just a few days ago, there were 3 public executions of people that were convicted in the Ansar al-Sharia's court system of providing intelligence to the Americans to be used in drone attacks, including one person who was executed in the very place where Anwar al-Awlaki's 16-year-old son, who was a U.S. citizen, was killed in a U.S. drone strike. And they executed this man alleging that he had provided intelligence to the Americans that had contributed to the death of Abdulrahman al-Awlaki, the 16-year-old son of Anwar al-Awlaki. President Obama authorized strikes that resulted in 3 U.S. citizens being killed in less than a month in Yemen. Anwar al-Awlaki, who was born in New Mexico, Anwar al-Awlaki's 16-year-old son, and then Samir Khan, who's another U.S. citizen from North Carolina and was the editor of Inspire magazine, the English-language publication of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. All 3 of those U.S. citizens were killed within 1 month. And so in short, what you have is suspicion that maybe Saleh allowed this to happen on the one hand, but then on the other hand, all of these powerful tribes that are infinitely more powerful than al-Qaeda, that al-Qaeda wants no war with at all because they would lose, are now starting to say, if there's no government here, if there's no services, if the Americans are bombing us and killing Bedouins and our civilians and leaving cluster bombs on our countryside and doing nothing to clean them up and not providing any civilian infrastructure support, but just supporting Saleh's family military and just bombing us, what motive do we have to fight al-Qaeda? There are people from our tribes. They don't bother us. So what's our motivation? One tribal leader who said very clearly, al-Qaeda is a terrorist organization. Yes, these guys want to destroy America. Said to me, you consider them terrorists. We consider the drones terrorism because they don't bother them. They're a threat on a tiny magnitude to the United States and its allies that has been given a prominence in the U.S. counterterrorism paranoia machine that is almost laughable if it's not so serious.
The relationship